Hey everybody, welcome back to another discussion video. Today we're taking a look at Void Rivals number 2, published July 18th, 2023. This issue is the second chapter in Skybound's Energon Universe, a shared universe including Void Rivals, Transformers, G.I. Joe, and whatever else Skybound decides to eventually throw in. If there's going to be anything else, I don't know. Anyway, let's jump right into it. Void Rivals number 2 is primarily focused on world building and character development, with an emphasis on one of the protagonists in particular, the Agorian pilot Darak. The first issue left off with Darak and Celila removing their helmets, discovering that they are actually quite similar in appearance in terms of being human-like, something that Darak says he saw in a vision. Their respective appearances were surprising to Darak and Celila because, based on the dialogue in issue number 1, each was expecting the other to be hideous, misshapen, and monstrous in appearance. All that, as well as all the rules and decrees that prohibit interactions between Agorians and Zertonians that don't involve killing each other, was building up to what we see in the opening of issue number 2, with a flashback to Darak setting out on his mission, which was to catch a comet carrying 4,000 tons of ice, much needed resources that are in short supply. And in addition to bolstering their own resources, the ice from the comet would enable the Agorians to gain an advantage over the Zertonians by preventing them from replenishing their dwindling water supply. After getting the world's worst pep talk from the world's worst father, Darak's ship launches from the Sacred Ring, which requires him to leave the event horizon of the black hole that the Sacred Ring orbits. Crossing the event horizon causes Darak to experience the vision he mentioned in issue number 1, where a voice reveals the now forgotten or purposefully concealed history of the Agorians, Zertonians, and the Sacred Ring. Once, the Agorians and Zertonians each occupied separate planets and were locked in a war with each other, ceasing hostilities only once it became apparent that their sun was dying. The two civilizations came together in order to survive the collapse of their sun, the effort taking thousands of years but ultimately culminating in the creation of the Sacred Ring. The peace made during this trial didn't last, with hostilities flaring back up again, and as time passed, their shared history of cooperation and cohabitation was lost to time. With the two civilizations cut off from each other, their only knowledge of the opposing side came from propaganda used to propel the war forward. Darak's vision indicates that the Agorian and Zertonian people must come together again, just as they did thousands of years ago, because something called Goliant is on the horizon. Back in the present, after hearing Darak's story, Celila insists that the Agorian heard the voice of Zerta, a mystical figure of some sort that seems to be important to the Zertonians. Putting these revelations aside, the pair get back to the issue of their immediate survival, stripping Darak's ship down to a rocket and using the circuitry of their helmets to repair vital navigational systems. The effort takes 20 days, but is ultimately successful. The rocket launches off the planetoid, but the outlook is still bleak, being unable to travel fast enough to reach the Sacred Ring before they starve to death, and the remote possibility of their distress signal being received and acted on in time carries just as pessimistic of an outlook. After several days, however, Darak and Celila are found and captured by an asteroid that's been converted into a ship, and the Skuxxoid, the pilot, demands their surrender, and that closes issue number 2. And I touched on this earlier, but the main thing with this issue is that it's kind of shining a spotlight on Darak, giving us a glimpse of Agorian society and his place in it, as well as the pressures and expectations he faces, having an extremely harsh father in what I assume is a prominent political position. I think backing up and exploring the events prior to the first issue makes sense. Void Rivals number 1 dropped us right into this world with little in the way of setup for who these characters are and what they were up to before they crashed. Not only does it make sense, but it throws some welcome scraps of information about this new world Kirkman and Felici are building. We get our first sense of what the Agorian side of things look like at the Sacred Ring, and confirmation that all Agorians and Zertonians have the same mysterious orange and green jewels on their heads. We also get further glimpses of Darak's rebellious streak, where he mentions a job as something called an edgewalker that he took to rebel against his father. Little character moments like these help to further justify and explain the actions of the characters, such as why Darak was seemingly quick to put aside years of cultural animosity and strict regulations to work with Celila Celila to survive. Even ignoring the impact of the vision he experienced, Darak's not overly fanatical, and the same could be said of Celila. And despite their first reactions of trying to kill each other, they are able to set all that baggage aside, and that's what enables them to eventually escape the planet that they're stranded on. And of course, another component of that is Darak's vision. While Darak and Celila were already willing to cooperate and work together, I think it's safe to say that removing their helmets changed things forever for both of them. Not only did that action lend credence to Darak's vision and give it some weight, but it effectively calls into question everything the Agorians and Zertonians had been told about their opponents. Darak and Celila have direct evidence in the form of each other that their conflict is built on falsehoods and lies. I think that's why Celila is so willing to believe Darak's story about his vision and the potential shared history of their civilizations. And although there's more of an emphasis on Darak here, we still get some good moments with Celila as well. The sequence when we see her inner conflict about her actions and what that means to the Zertonian people and to her is good stuff, and it helps to establish the no-win situation the duo seem to find themselves in, where they can't really go back to their old lives, both because of how their actions would be judged by their respective leaders, as well as how the information they've gained that upends everything they thought they knew about the other side changes everything. Given the emphasis on duality in this book so far, I'm expecting the formal structure of the book to follow suit as well, with Celila receiving a similar Spotlight-esque treatment where we find out more about her and the Zertonian society she comes from. If not in the next issue, then hopefully soon after. And the big tie-in to Transformers in this issue comes in towards the end, with Darak and Celila's craft being seized by Skuxxoid's Rockeroid. Skuxxoid is something of a surprising pull from Season 3, one that I don't think a lot of G1 fans were champing at the bit to see, but maybe I'm wrong about that. I know I certainly wasn't, just speaking for myself. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I think it was a bad idea. There are tons of characters and ideas that are continually brought back and used in new iterations of Transformers fiction, so I feel like we should maybe give Kirkman some credit for plucking something less frequently used and a bit more obscure in the history of the franchise to bring back. Like Jetfire, the Skuxxoid is very faithful to his cartoon appearances, and I think the character design definitely has its charms. It feels like a very 80s cartoon design, and I can dig that. It's definitely weird though. I mean, he's an anthropomorphic snake man with a pig snout, and is that a keyhole? Is this guy wearing a chastity belt? Dude's got to protect his virtue, I guess. Or maybe it's a self-discipline thing. Rockroid's not going to build itself, you know, especially if you spend all your time fiddling with your dingus. Regardless, it'll be interesting to see where things go with the Skuxxoid. He was a mercenary in the G1 cartoon, and he worked for the Quintessons during 5 Faces of Darkness. Now, the Quintessons, those are some characters that I'd like to see introduced into the comics and play a prominent role. It remains to be seen if the Skuxxoid will have any connection to the Quintessons here, but it could be a way to potentially introduce them while simultaneously paying homage to that alliance from the cartoon. Or they could do something completely different, which I'd be open to as well. I'm just definitely in the space where I would like to see more. I don't know if we're going to get much of an emphasis on the Transformers side of things in Void Rivals, but I would like to get a little more than what we're getting currently. The cameos are nice and they're fun and all, but just want something with a little bit more bite, you know? That's not necessarily a complaint. Void Rivals is supposed to be its own thing, so I'm trying to be careful about the expectations I'm putting on it. My main complaint is actually that I feel a little let down by the art in just one sequence towards the beginning. Don't misunderstand me. I think that the art throughout is really good, but during the part for the Agorian launch site at the beginning of the book, I just feel like it's not as strong. I love the way Dave Felici established locations in issue number 1, as well as other parts of this issue, but this area just isn't operating at the same caliber for me. This is our first look at inside the Agorian half of the Sacred Ring, after all. So unfortunately, it's just a little underwhelming in terms of giving us a sense of what makes this civilization interesting, or even what the overall vibe of the place is. I mean, it's functional, don't get me wrong, but it's overly sparse. There's not much in the way of bells and whistles like we see elsewhere. And I know that the background isn't the most important aspect of this sequence, and we spend such a short amount of time here. So ultimately, I think it's fine as long as we eventually get a sense of what makes the Sacred Ring visually interesting at some point in the future. But yeah, just a little letdown here. And it might be fair to assume that Dave Felici's focus was elsewhere and that the backgrounds in this section just had to be good enough to meet deadlines, which is fair and makes sense looking at some of the other art in this issue. The imagery of the exterior of the sacred ring, on the other hand, is a personal highlight for me. The whole concept is just wild as hell in a way that I can easily get behind, and Dave Felici translated this idea to the page in spectacular fashion. The sacred ring is like this transparent donut that the Agorians and Zertonians scooped their planets into, and then they locked it around a black hole. Pretty crazy, and raises a lot of questions about the nature of the structure itself and why it's so close to the black hole. Is the ring keeping the black hole from expanding? Is it drawing power from it? How do the Agorians and Zertonians perceive time? I'm no scientist, but it sounds like the sacred ring is pretty much at the event horizon of the black hole, so I can't help but wonder how that affects reality itself for Agorians and Zertonians. Anyway, I think the sacred ring looks amazing. I want to spend more time inside of that tube and learn more about it, and part of what makes it look so good is Matheus Lopes's color work. You've got that cool gas or whatever cloud surrounding the black hole. Again, not a scientist. And then the halves of the ring itself, which show what appears to be weather patterns as well as lights from cities or fortresses or what have you. Also, nice to see that the Agorians and Zertonians are extremely on brand in keeping the colors of their halves of the sacred ring consistent with the orange and green that matches their forehead gems and clothing. That's dedication. I think pretty much all the space stuff looks awesome in this book. This page specifically is a huge highlight for me, and the colors make it sing in a way that's just extremely gorgeous. We don't get much with the interior of the Rockeroid, but this panel is quite nice. And I think it highlights what I thought was missing from the Agorian launch site that I mentioned earlier. This area is interesting to look at with all of the screens and lights. It's very high-tech mixed in with a cave, and the floor is tiled and seems to be a reflective surface. I don't know if I'm explaining this well or getting my point across, but it just seems like there's more here to look at that ultimately makes the space more immersive and interesting. Lastly, I also really dig how this makeshift rocket turned out in terms of how it's drawn. I think it's a really cool design, and the amount of detail makes for the kind of image that ends up keeping my eyes hovering over the panels it appears in, looking at all the interesting choices Dave Felici made to depict the nature and quality of this thing. And I love all the asymmetrical little touches. And aside from looking cool, it also really cements the fact that this craft was improvised out of what materials were on hand, and those materials were enough for the bare minimum and not much more. I'm kind of hoping this isn't the last we see of this thing, but it really could be. It's not as though it has much of a practical use anymore. And that's all I've got for now, really. I mean, this was a solid second issue. A lot of stuff in here that was mostly just adding flavor that will probably pay off in terms of the overall story, but it's maybe not the most exciting thing to read on its own. Regardless, I'm definitely looking forward to more. I'm still on board, curious to see if it's still just going to be a page or two of Transformers-related cameos and then back to Void Rivals, or if we're going to get more of that stuff. The balance is going to change. I don't know. We'll see. Thank you, as always, for watching this. Your support means a great deal. Please subscribe, hit the like button, and let me know what your thoughts are on this issue. Are you glad to see Skuxxoid make an appearance? What do you think about the world building in this issue? Are you excited for more, or are you not really feeling it? Sound off below, and I'll catch you next time. Take care.